Hana Kern, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program on this election day. Thank you also to our community partners who are supporting today's program, women business owners, and the Center for Czech Education and Culture. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website starting tomorrow. We at the Holocaust Center for Humanity acknowledge that our Holocaust Center is on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. The Duwamish are a people who are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. Whatever the results of the election, we can feel proud that we are part of a nation that is committed to the democratic process. Through studying the Holocaust, students learn how democratic institutions can fail. They learn the importance of speaking out for others, the dangers of intolerance and prejudice, and the difference one person can make. This past week at the Holocaust Center for Humanity, we offered our first live virtual field trip experience for students. With a docent in the museum and a staff member armed with 2 laptops, a group of students logged in, filled up the screen, and engaged in a conversation with the docent. Anita Reich, a docent with our Holocaust Center for the past 5 years, who has led countless field trips in person, was up for the initial challenge of leading students on a virtual field trip. Anita shared stories about local Holocaust survivors like Peter Metzlar, who as a child was hiding with his mom in the Netherlands. She highlighted artifacts in the exhibit like the yellow star Peter's mom was forced to wear. And she discussed the key turning points in the Holocaust, like Kristallnacht or the Night of Broken Glass, when a state-sponsored riot against Jews took place in November 1938. Above all rang the message that change begins with each one of us. Each one of us has a responsibility and the power to make a difference. The Holocaust Center for Humanity has risen to the challenge of finding new and innovative ways to continue to engage students, adults, and the community. One of the many advantages to these new virtual field trips is that classes who might otherwise never be able to make a trip to downtown Seattle now can meet with a docent and visit the museum virtually from anywhere. These programs would not be possible without the generous support of our donors. If you'd like to support our virtual programming and the center's mission, please check out our website today, holocaustcenterseattle.org. In addition to virtual field trips, the Holocaust Center's virtual programs include our Speakers Bureau of Survivors and Descendants of Survivors. Our speakers share their personal family stories, attaching real people to this history. One survivor, Tom Lenda, shared his story of survival for many years with students. Born in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, Tom was only 3 when the Nazis invaded the country. At 6 years old, the Nazis deported Tom and his family to the nearby concentration camp of Theresienstadt, or Terezin. Of the few Jewish survivors of Theresienstadt, even fewer were children. Tom Lenda was one of them. Today, Tom's daughter, Hana Kern, shares her father's story. Hana is an attorney in Seattle, and for years, Hana helped her father with his presentations in schools. She is proud to carry on her father's story and officially became a member of the Holocaust Center Speakers Bureau in 2019. Hana, I have been lucky enough to know your father over the years and I've heard him share his story personally. Thank you so much for being with us today to continue his legacy.
Thank you, Alana. Let me get my screen share happening here and we'll be able to get started. All right. There we go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hana Kern. I'm here to share with you today my father's Holocaust experience. First, just a little bit about me. Let's get that up there. There we go. First, a little bit about me. I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1966. At that time, Czechoslovakia was behind the Iron Curtain. It was under a communist regime that was controlled by the Soviet Union. When I was just 2 years old, my family was able to escape from that communist regime. We first escaped to Germany, then to Australia, where we spent time in a refugee camp, and eventually we made our way to Seattle, where my parents raised my sister and me. And I went then to the University of Washington, and as Alana mentioned, I practice law in Seattle today. So my dad's story, as Alana mentioned, my dad spent 3 years in the Terezín concentration camp as a child. His story is a little unusual for a couple of reasons. Number one, Terezín was a transit camp. Most folks that were sent to Terezín were sent on to Auschwitz or one of the other death camps. And also the fact that he survived there for 3 years. As Alana mentioned, there were very few child survivors. So why do I tell this story? I guess I'd like to start out for you with my father's why. Why did my dad tell the story? Growing up, my dad, like a lot of Holocaust survivors, did not talk about his experience. I was aware that he'd been in a camp. I had seen the numbers on my grandfather's forearm, so I knew that he and my grandmother had been in camps as well, but that's about all I knew. About 20 years ago, with the help of the Holocaust Center, my father developed his story and started to present to school children, and then he also wrote a book, which is still available on Amazon. So that was his why, and my why mirrors his. He has Alzheimer's now, he can't tell his story, so I want to keep that going. And also just for me personally, social justice has always been very important to me in my personal life and in my professional life. And I think as an immigrant, as a former refugee, it's just so crucial to us that stories like my dad's continue to be told. So let me introduce you to my dad.
I want to tell you how I was sent into prison when I was actually 6 years old. And I was kept in the prison for 3 years. And actually I was supposed to be murdered, but my murderers were too busy murdering others, so I survived.
All right, so I hope the audio is okay. We've been having some trouble with it. I'm just crossing my fingers that you folks can all hear those clips of my dad. So as my dad said, he was supposed to be murdered. So the question that I'd like you all to think about a little bit is, what in the world could a 6-year-old child have done to deserve a death sentence? All right, so starting out with a little bit of history, my father was born Thomas Otto Lustig on May 25th, 1936 in Pilsen in Czechoslovakia. And I'll also explain a little later why our family name is Lenda and not Lustig. He had 2 loving parents. There's a picture of him with his parents, my grandparents. His father was Pavel, in English that's Paul, and he was born in 1904. His mother, my grandmother, is Irene, and she was born in 1909. They were a close-knit family, and one of the things that my dad would always say during his presentations is they consider themselves Czech citizens first and foremost. He would say, we proudly considered ourselves to be Czechoslovakian citizens of Jewish origin. So Czechoslovakia at that time was a democratic island in Europe. As you all probably know by now, it's 2 countries at this time, Czech Republic and Slovakia. But at the time, it was 1 country since 1918 after the end of the First World War. You can see Pilsen over there in the western portion of Czechoslovakia, and that's where my dad was born. Pilsen is close to Germany, as you can see, so there was an aggressive neighbor to the west. So let's talk briefly about that aggressive neighbor. After World War I, Germany really struggled. There was a lack of money, a lack of food, and a lack of work, and that fostered the political and social climate that led to World War II. When folks like the Germans in that situation are suffering, it is very easy for one group to point their finger at another group and to assign responsibility and blame for that first group suffering. It's appealing to focus all that hate in one direction. It catches on. We see this in other atrocities in the world. The idea that this isn't my fault, so it must be your fault, whoever that you is. And of course, if we can get rid of that you, then our troubles will be over and our suffering will end. So this was the climate that allowed someone like Adolf Hitler to come to power, a very aggressive leader with very definite ideas about who was to blame for Germany's suffering. As you all know, according to Hitler, the Jews were to blame for all the suffering of the Germans in the 1920s and in the 1930s. So anti-Semitism, prejudice against or hatred of Jews. I'm sure most of you, all of you probably have heard that word. It has existed in Europe for hundreds of years. However, it was really brought to the forefront by Adolf Hitler and his followers. His political party, with him at the lead, really fostered hatred of the Jews. They started a vicious campaign of propaganda against the Jews. And at the time, the Jews in Germany were persecuted very harshly. It was basically government-sanctioned hatred, and it spread. The Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia in two phases, partly in 1938 and then more completely in 1939. In 1938, the part of Czechoslovakia that the Nazis occupied included Pilsen, where my family lived. So that is where our story of terror begins, in Pilsen. Out of the Pilsen Jews, 2,600 of them were deported. Only 200, less than 10%, survived. Because the occupation of Pilsen in that part of Czechoslovakia happened so very early in this process, the Jews in Pilsen were particularly hard hit. They were some of the first to be sent to concentration camps, and many of them perished there. My father would always talk about his family during his presentations, and here's another clip for you.
So I want to tell you the names of the members of our family. Most of them were murdered, actually. So you will help me to remember them.
So it was real important to my dad to share photos of his family. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen there a couple of family photos, the red arrow indicating my dad. In the upper photo, that is his father, my grandfather, holding his hand. In the lower photo, his grandpa is standing in the background there. Also in both of these photos are my grandmother and then her mother, so my great-grandmother as well. So the family was able to move from Pilsen to Prague very shortly after the Nazis initially invaded. Here's a picture of the synagogue in Prague. You can see the distance, or the synagogue in Pilsen, sorry. The distance to Prague is only about 58 miles. So the way that happened was immediately when the Nazis invaded, my grandfather recognized the danger and he left for Prague. My grandmother and my father were still in Pilsen, and the Nazis hauled them into the police station for questioning. They wanted to know where my grandfather was. At the time, my grandfather was a businessman. He spoke several languages. He worked for a textile factory as a business representative, and he would travel nationally and internationally on behalf of his employer. So my grandmother was able to convince the authorities that she didn't know where her husband was, that he was away on a business trip and just didn't know when he'd be back. They let her go. They hauled her back in about a week later and questioned her again. She had my dad with her both those times, and he sat there on her lap as the officers questioned her. But the second time they did let her go again, and shortly thereafter, my grandmother and dad joined my grandfather in a suburb outside of Prague where he'd been able to find them accommodation. Here are some photos from the time that they lived in this area near Prague. You'll see in the upper right, my dad with his toy car. The family at the time used to joke that my dad was the only one with a car in the family because the Nazis had forbidden Jewish people from owning automobiles. So he was the only one that had a car. The Nazis also forbade the Jews from engaging in sports. You can see that that directive wasn't followed by my family at the time. You can see my dad there in his little ski togs in the lower right. My father would also talk about some of the folks that he knew during this period of his life. He recalled a couple of boys that lived next door named Peter and John. They were taken away to Terezín, sent on to a death camp and murdered. My father also talked about his grandpa, Bedřich Lustig, his uncles Leo and Pavel, and then his maternal grandmother, Olga Spitz. All of them were sent to Terezín, sent on to death camps, and then murdered. I want to tell you briefly about my grandfather's two brothers, Fred and Otto. Fred engaged in partisan resistance to the Nazis and spent the war years on the run in the partisan underground. Otto, the other brother, left Czechoslovakia and moved to Shanghai, where he spent the war years. And then afterwards, he immigrated to Toronto. And that is where he lived the rest of his life with his family. So my father could not understand why his friends and family were vanishing. As I mentioned to you, these friends that he played with and other people in the area, the Jewish folks were disappearing. And his recollection from that period is it was very concerning and frustrating and confusing to a little boy to have playmates one day and then they'd be gone. So here's my dad talking about some of the regulations that were put into place that the Jewish folks had to abide by.
September 1st, 1941, all the Jews had to wear yellow star, older than 6 years.
So there were a number of regulations that were placed upon the Jewish people at this time. As my dad mentioned, the yellow star, of course, most of you will have heard of that. My father recalls his mother sewing that yellow star onto all of the family's clothing, together with a couple of other ladies that she knew. There were employment restrictions. I had mentioned to you that my grandfather had been a businessman, a representative of a textile factory. He was permitted only to perform manual labor at this time. There were education restrictions. It was forbidden to educate Jewish children, so my father was not allowed to start school. There were shopping restrictions. Jews could only shop in certain stores and at certain times of day. There was rationing, there were shortages, there were recreational restrictions, as I've already mentioned. There were restrictions on travel, and there were restrictions on the sale of property. The restrictions of food were one of the things that led to my father's uncle Pavel being sent to the concentration camp. He had purchased some food along with a neighbor woman on the black market. He was caught, and that resulted in them being sent to the top of the list for deportation to Terezín. That uncle was still at Terezín when my father and his parents arrived, but shortly thereafter was sent on, and as I'd mentioned, he was murdered as well. All right, I think we can take a little pause for questions here. So let me see if I can stop my screen share. And then I think, Alana, if you have teed up any questions, then we can take those.
Sure, thank you, Hana. Yes, there's a couple questions here. One of them comes from Martin, and he asks, how was your dad able to retrieve the photos of his family?
So that's a really good question. And like with a lot of folks, my family had friends who were not Jewish and who were willing to hide some things. So they were able to retrieve those after the war. There were a lot of good people out there who helped, and you've probably heard some of these stories, but yeah, so they were hidden by some other folks.
And there's one other question here that asks, did your father or his relatives grow up with a feeling of Czech national pride, or it being such a young democracy? Where did their pride fall in their nationalism? It's a great question, and definitely they had Czech national pride. As I mentioned, they consider themselves Czech citizens first of a Jewish origin. And for those of you that know a little bit about the history of Czechoslovakia, it was kind of a big deal that it became this democratic country after World War I. The Czech leaders fought really hard for that. There was support from America for that. And the Czech people took great pride in being a democracy. That's great. That's all we have for the moment. So let's continue, and we can stop again towards the end for questions. Okay, sounds good. Let me make sure I get my correct screen up to share. And there we go. Okay, so the next part of the presentation begins with my dad and his family being deported to Terezín. They received notice that they were to report in Prague on September 12th, 1942 for transport.
We are joining 1,000 Jewish people from Prague and the vicinity who were going to Terezin in the same transport, were supposed to. We were there for about 2 days, sleeping on the floor already. Big hall, exhibition hall. In the evening, somebody would shout, Achtung, which is stand up or something in German. And so some people didn't know, most of the Jewish people knew the language, so it spread around and everybody would stand up and then they would give us some instructions.
All right, that's my last video clip, so bear with me for a minute. I think if I delete that, it will make the quality of the visuals a little better. All right, so my dad and his family, as you heard, were sent to an exhibition hall where they gathered with other Jewish people in Prague. The Jewish adults were allowed to take only 50 kilograms per person. That's about 110 pounds of their personal belongings. They had to leave everything else behind. They spent that time waiting, not knowing what was going to happen to them. And then after 3 days, they were taken by train. So these are some photos of the train station from which they were deported. I took these pictures myself. I was in Prague about 1.5 years ago, and I was curious about the train station. This is not a train station that I'd ever heard of in terms of visiting Prague, and you wouldn't have either because no trains go there anymore. So it was hard to find. I got a taxi, and after a little bit of blundering, we were able to find it. It's in a rundown part of town. There really is no way to know that this is such a momentous place, except there is this one plaque. And the plaque talks about how they would like to set up some kind of memorial there, but I believe the funding isn't there yet. This was part of the plaque that I thought was very interesting, that 50,000 Czech Jews were deported for extermination from this particular location. All right, so where did they go? So from Prague, Terezín is not a very long ways away. They were taken there by train. The last 3 miles from where the train ended to Terezín didn't have, they had to walk that. There was no train there. So, you know what, I was wrong. I'm gonna optimize this again. I do have one more video. All right, so they had to walk those last 3 miles, and here's my dad recalling what that walking journey was like.
Well, I had a little backpack, and this was full of batteries and flashlights. And I was really proud that I could do something in this situation. 6 years old boy, so I did something for the good. And we walked to Terezín.
So they had to walk those last 3 miles. And so what happened when they arrived? So let's talk a little bit about Terezín concentration camp. Terezín was initially built about 200 years previously as a military fortress. It was intended to house about 6,000 people. The day that my parents arrived, there were almost 60,000 Jewish prisoners being held there. The day that my parents arrived, statistics tell us that 156 prisoners died there on that day. In total, 139,654 Jewish prisoners were sent to Terezín during the Nazi occupation. 33,430 of them were killed at Terezín. That's about a quarter. So when my dad and his parents arrived, they were sent to an exhibition hall that was there with all the other folks that were arriving on their train. The Jewish people had a nickname for this exhibition hall, and that nickname was Šlojska. Šlojska is a word that comes from the Czech word šlojskovat, which is a slang term for stealing. And that's what happened in that room. The Nazi officers would open the luggage brought by the Jewish people. They would remove whatever valuables they saw that appealed to them and then hand them their luggage back. After this, My dad and his parents were sent to the barracks where they were going to sleep. There was no room on the first floor of the barracks or on the second or on the third. So they were relegated to the attic. They were given giant bags that they were told to fill with hay, drag them upstairs to the dark attic, and then find a place to sleep. So that is what they did. They found the attic crowded with just plywood boards, but they weren't able to find a corner where they could settle, and they did. My father recalls waking up that first morning and realizing that an elderly person sleeping right next to him had died overnight. His mother, of course, was horrified and tried to shield her small boy from that sight. Another young mother said to her, "There's no point in trying to hide your son's eyes. He's going to see death every single day." My father came to learn that the salient features of life in the concentration camp were death everywhere, fleas and bugs, the constant feeling of an empty stomach because there was not enough food to go around, confusion, crowding, chaos, and the permanent threat of being sent to a transport to the east. At the time, the folks at Terezín were not exactly sure what happened to the people that were sent to the east. What they were told was that these were working transports. These folks were being sent on to work. But as time passed and none of the people that had been sent away returned, and none of them even wrote letters, people began to suspect the worst. The one kind of positive recollection Dad has from this period is that little backpack that he carried with flashlights and batteries came in very handy. The attic was dark at night. There was not a speck of light. And as a 6-year-old boy, he often needed to use the bathroom, which meant a trek down several flights of stairs. And so it was really nice to have a little bit of light there. So my grandparents got the lay of the land and realized that number one, the thing to do was avoid a transport if possible. And number two, the way to do that was to get a job and make themselves valuable in the concentration camp. So my grandfather was able to obtain a job in the transportation corps. For that, he had to move in with the other folks who worked in that department. My grandmother had been a nurse, a registered nurse, before she had my dad, and that came in very handy as nurses were needed. So she obtained a job as a nurse in the hospital there. Sleeping quarters came with her job as well. So there's my dad. He's got his father has to go live over here. His mother has to go live over there. So what do you do with a 6-year-old boy who has never been separated from his parents, who's lived in a comfortable apartment with his parents his entire life? Well, they have to live separately. The Nazis had created homes, or in German, heims, where children were placed. Most of those children were orphans. So this is my dad talking about when his grandmother took him there.
Now I started to realize that most of the children who were there, well, they were as old as me or a little bit older. They were actually orphans already, or half orphans. So I was lucky that I had both of my parents with me. Most of the parents would go in a transport to the east. It was a working transport that nobody came back.
All right, I'm not sure if you got the audio from that one, but it was just saying that he was sent to the heim and most of the kids there were orphans. And he came to learn that as these parents, the adults, had mostly been sent on to the east and to the death camps. So what was life in the heim like? Dad always made a point to talk about the supervisors that he had in the heim. These were young women, maybe had been teachers in their previous life. He knew one for sure had been a teacher, and they were the supervisors. The names that he would always mention are the 3 supervisors he remembered the most: Gerda, Hanka, and Erna. These 3 all were teachers by profession. Gerda got married while in the concentration camp, while at Terezín, and she and her husband were transported to a death camp and murdered there. After that, Hanka became the main teacher. One of the memories that I have is when my dad and I finally went back to Czechoslovakia in the early 90s, and neither of us had been there since the 60s, the first thing Dad wanted to do was seek out Hanka. She was still alive. She was living in an apartment in Prague, and we went to visit her, and that was a very, very poignant reunion. So as I mentioned, Dad realized he was one of the other ones, or one of the lucky kids. All the other ones were basically orphans, or at least half orphans. They had one or two parents that had already been sent off to extermination camps. Dad realized that basically it was a race against time. This was a Nazi murdering machine. And would that machine collapse before Dad's turn to be murdered came? I mentioned to you that educating Jewish children was forbidden. So this was also the case in Terezin. Educating children was punishable by moving to the top of the transport list and being immediately transported to a death camp. However, this did not stop the brave teachers. They wanted to create a normal life as possible for the children. They smuggled in books and blackboards, and after the chores were done, they taught those kids the alphabet. They taught them how to read, how to write, how to count and do math. Stories from history were told. Rabbis would come in and tell stories from the Bible, and popular performers would come in. The Jewish leaders recognized the importance of creating some normalcy for these kids. They're in this horrific environment, and they didn't want them, or they wanted to minimize the extent to which they would be prohibited from leading a normal life should they make it out at the end of the war. So my father recalls that the teachers would be cheerful, and they would just create this environment of normalcy. Just here we are in school every day, being upbeat, singing songs, and having regular lessons. One of the results of this was that my dad, as a 9-year-old after the war, was able to engage in school with children of his own age. He was put in a classroom appropriate for 9-year-olds. One of the things that happened while my dad was at Terezin was that there was an SS inspection of his heim. It was a close call. He recalls that there had been a little boy walking with what is traditionally a school backpack, or was a school backpack in those days, and an SS officer stopped him and asked him where he was going. The little boy, without thinking, replied, "Well, I'm on my way to school." So drama ensued. The Czech elders fortunately learned that there was going to be an inspection of the particular heim, and they were able to warn the teachers, and everything was well hidden. My father said that the morning of the inspection, the SS officers came in their uniforms and their white gloves, everything polished and tidy to a T, and they didn't want to touch the Jewish people or anything belonging to the Jewish people. Instead of searching actively for evidence of education happening, they used a stick to poke and prod the beds and to lift the bedding a little bit, which ended up being really good news for the Jews. They found nothing, and no one was sent away on a transport as a result of that particular inspection. Another thing that my dad recalls from Terezin is soccer. Soccer was very popular. You can see in this picture, this is an artist's rendition of the barracks, the Jewish prisoners kind of in the archways of those barracks, and a soccer game going on. My dad would talk about how the children as well had their own soccer league, and one of my father's uncles was a star of the soccer league, and so he took my dad under his wing and taught him to play a little bit of soccer. And my dad would say he doesn't think he became really a better soccer player, but it might have raised his stature with the other kids a little bit. One of the other things he would talk about is that the kids didn't have a soccer ball, and so what they would do is they would take one kid's sock and then stuff that sock with everybody else's socks, and that would create their soccer ball. And my father recalls being chastised by his mothers for always losing his socks. Some of you may have heard about the Red Cross visit to Terezin in June of 1944. This came about at the behest of the Danish king. The Danish king was suspicious because Danish Jews had been deported to these camps, and he raised enough of a fuss that the Red Cross demanded that they be permitted to visit. So the Nazis permitted a visit to Terezin. What they did in advance of the visit is that they forced the prisoners to beautify Terezin. Flowers were planted, the barracks were cleaned, roads were mended. There was a fake school created. There was a fake bank created. In fact, when I was assisting my parents with cleaning out their home, I found these banknotes. These weren't good for anything. You couldn't actually buy anything. They were created specifically for the purpose of fooling the Red Cross. And the Red Cross was fooled. They didn't find anything suspicious, and they bought the Nazi story. This is also about the time, or shortly after this, that my grandfather was assigned to a transport. This happened in the fall of 1944. He had to go, and by that time, my father and his mother were very well aware that something very bad was happening to the folks leaving on these transports. My father would talk about the memories he has of his father from this period, that all he had was the memory of how his father was always in high spirits, no matter what. He was always expecting the end of the war, always talking about how this was going to pass. He appreciated culture. He was an avid musician. As I mentioned, he spoke many languages. He would take my father to the cultural performances, including the Brundibar children's opera that took place there. Just one comment on culture as well. There were many artists and musicians in Terezin. They were forbidden, just like the teachers were forbidden from teaching the children. They were forbidden from engaging in theater and musical performances, but they did it anyway. They were able to do that without the Nazis catching on. There was a low ratio of guards to prisoners. And as I mentioned previously, the guards were very reluctant to mingle with the prisoners. So there were some cultural performances that in an effort to keep up the spirits of the people. And, you know, as with the teachers, if a performer was caught performing, that was their ticket to one of the death camps. At about this time, Hitler also created a propaganda film. It was called Hitler Gave a Town to the Jews, and it was a similar concept to the cleaning up of Terezin for the Red Cross visit. The idea that Terezin is a beautiful and comfortable retirement community for Jewish people. One thing I wanted to mention too is, as a result of the Red Cross wanting to come and visit, many Jews were deported because Nazis did not want Terezin to appear overcrowded. So one of the unintended results of that Red Cross visit was that many more folks were sent on to the death camps. So my father recalls this film. My understanding is that the entire film does not survive, but clips of it do exist. Dad recalls being assigned a white shirt that he had to wear, being in the audience at a performance, being told he couldn't look around. He recalls that during this window also, one of the things that he and some of the other kids had to do when there were visitors was sit on the laps of the SS officers and act very friendly toward them. And of course, these were the hated terror mongers in the camp. They had to sit on the laps of these folks and be offered sardines, which was a treat, but they had to refuse the sardines and say, oh, no, uncle, my stomach is too full. No, thank you. One of the other things my father recalls is being forced to carry the ashes of the dead. As I mentioned to you, many people died in Terezin. Initially, they were buried, but after a while, this became inefficient. And so the Nazis wanted to dispose of all these ashes. So they decided that they were going to get rid of them. They told the Jewish people that the ashes were being taken to Prague to be interned in the Jewish cemetery. In fact, my father was one of the children that you see depicted in that drawing on the left that had to carry boxes of ashes to these wagons. And on the right, you see that same place. That's a photograph that my dad took years later in the late 90s. So the children had to carry the boxes of ashes to these carts. The Nazis then forced teenage boys to take those carts down to the river and dump the ashes in. They then murdered those teenage boys so that the secret would die with them. In the spring of 1945, as the end of the war was approaching, my dad's recollections from that time are a little bit different and a little bit more intense. On the positive side, they were seeing planes fly overhead, which was a signal that the end of the war might be coming. You know, American planes that they hadn't seen before, different kinds of planes. On a very negative and somber note, a death march came through Terezin that my dad recalls. He recalls that there were walls of the Terezin onlookers with people holding them back, kind of a human chain holding them back, and then these he calls them drifters or ghosts, came through that didn't even seem human. They were wearing blue and white rags just falling off their bodies. They were thin as skeletons, and they didn't even seem conscious. Dad's vivid recollection is they just didn't seem human. They had forgotten their human dignity long ago because of the horrors that they were subjected to. Dad recalls that people in this group would fall down and they would die right there, and folks would come with stretchers from the Jewish community in Terezin and take them away. He also recalled someone throwing a little piece of bread into their midst, and that they just dove for it. Like he said, it was like chickens at feeding time, that these poor people were not even human anymore. They also had typhoid, and they brought typhoid to Terezin, which will factor into our story in just a while. So I want to share with you a little bit about the fate of those sent to Terezin. Here are some numbers for you to look at while I speak. I think the point that is really poignant to me is, out of all the children that were sent to Terezin, 15,000 children out of the 18,000 Jewish children in Czechoslovakia were sent to Terezin. In my father's age group of age 9 and under, only 48 children survived. This has impacted the Czech population of Jews to this day. You know, over 350,000 of the Jewish people were living in Czechoslovakia in 1930. Only 6,500 of them remain to this day. So what happened with my family? So my grandfather had been deported to Auschwitz, as I mentioned. His story is beyond the scope of my presentation and the time I have today, but he did manage to escape at the very end of the war. Auschwitz was liberated from the east, and he was able to join the Soviet army. He then joined, as soon as he could, the Czech army. In the army, he met his brother, Fred. You may recall that I talked about Fred at the very beginning. He was the one in the Czech underground, and at that time, toward the end of the war, he was an officer in the Czech army. At that time, Fred had changed his name a number of times while in the underground, and at the time that he reunited with my grandfather, his last name was Lenda. And my grandfather said, my family is going to take that name too. My wife and son and I will also take that name. So that is how we came to the last name Lenda. My grandfather, when he met with Fred, of course, a poignant reunion there, and Fred asked him, is there anything you need? What do you need? And he said, you know, all I really need right now is, I'd sure love a violin. And so Fred procured a violin for him. As soon as he could, one more thing I want to mention to you, both my grandfather and his brother took part in the liberation fights, and they both received medals for their courage and efforts. So as soon as he could, my father made his way back to Terezin to hopefully retrieve his wife and child. He arrived in Terezin on May 25th, 1945. It's my dad's 9th birthday. On his 9th birthday, Dad was sitting in his heim. He was expecting to visit with his mother later in the day. A woman that was friends with his mother came in the morning and said, you need to come to your mom's barracks. So he was surprised, but he followed her. And there in his mom's barrack was his father. So at that time, the three left Terezin, but my grandmother soon returned. My grandmother had made a promise to God when her husband was sent to Auschwitz, that if her husband returned alive after the war, she would stay at Terezin as long as her services were needed there. So at this time, her services were needed. There was typhoid in the camp, and so the family returned to Terezin. My grandmother stayed there, and then my father and my grandfather left. And for a while, my dad lived with his dad in the army barracks before my grandmother left Terezin after the typhoid was no longer an issue, and they lived together. Here are some photos from the post-war years. That is my grandfather in his uniform, and then a couple of my dad, and one of my dad and grandfather. Here's some photos from Terezin that my parents took. In the upper left, that's my dad standing there. He and my mom visited the area, and you can see my grandmother's barracks. They went through and they took photos. If any of you ever have that opportunity, I encourage you to visit. There is a delightful small museum. It's got amazing artwork by the children of Terezin and a lot of other information. After the war, my family settled they went to Prague initially, and then they settled in a town called Šumperk in Moravia. And then my father went back to Prague for university. Here's some more pictures. That's my dad. Was in his late teens on his left. I don't know, some of you folks listening may know my son Max, and that picture brings tears to my eyes every time. That could be Max. Anyway, some other photos here. My dad served in the Army. Military service was compulsory at the time. So in the upper right, that's him in his Army uniform. On the far right, kind of looking toward the camera there. And then down below, my father's younger brother, Peter, was born in 1948. So those are my grandparents with Peter in the baby carriage. A few family photos for you, my parents' marriage. There's my birth certificate, my Czech birth certificate, and my mother and me, and then my father with me playing. As I mentioned, we left Prague in 1968. We were able to escape the communist regime. We made our way to Munich. There's a picture of me as a small girl in Munich. And then from there, we managed to emigrate to Australia, where we lived for 6 years. We initially spent time in a refugee camp, but then were able to rent a small house. The goal was always, though, to come to America. There's my mom's passport with our US visas, and our trip took us from Sydney to New Zealand with a stop in Tahiti, Los Angeles, and then up to Seattle. And this is a document I'm very proud of. I became a naturalized American citizen at age 14. Here's the home where I was raised, my parents' house. My grandparents were able to visit us. Even though they lived behind the Iron Curtain, visits were occasionally permitted. So that's a picture of my grandparents visiting us in Seattle when I was in my early teen years. Here's a picture of my family in 1984, my sister, me, and dad, and then mom. Here's a more recent picture of my parents and I a couple of years ago. That's me, of course, and then my two kids, Max, who looks just like my dad there, and then my daughter, Sarah. So next, I'm going to show you a slide with some statistics. We are getting close to the end of my talk, but I do want to leave time for questions. If you have questions, I think you can submit those by chat, and then Alana will be able to raise those when we're done here. So the purpose of this slide is to remind us all that a lot of what we saw or what the folks saw during World War II still goes on today. There are displaced people worldwide, and these are important statistics for us to remember. I also want to share with you my dad's book. You may be interested in learning more. So actually, this is two books. The one on the left is my dad's book, Children on Death Row. It's got photos in it, and he tells a story. He published it under his birth name of Tommy Lustig. On the right is another book this is a historical fiction book. It is based on my grandfather's life story. And I encourage you, if you are interested, to take a look at that as well. So before we get to the questions, I want to leave you with a couple more thoughts. The first one is that my dad would always say, there is one thing that we can agree with the Nazis on, and that is that children are the most precious resource that a society has. And, the Nazis, of course, used that idea for evil by systematically concentrating on murdering the Jewish children. Their plan was that years after even the Nazis were gone, there would simply be no Jews. So that's important for us to think about today. There are still children in the world that are marginalized. And my dad would always say to his audiences, which were mostly school children, I hope that you'll be the one to speak up. I hope that you'll be the one to help bring an end to all this, all the suffering that we see, and do your small part. The other thing that I want to return to is the question that I asked at the outset, is what could a 6-year-old child have done to deserve a death sentence? And of course, the answer to that is he was born Jewish. That was his crime. And, we see this in our society today a fair bit. Folks are punished and marginalized for things like the color of their skin or perhaps their religious persuasion. And that's something that we need to be mindful of and put a stop to. So you heard Dad's story, and I just want to leave you with the reminder that Dad is one voice, and there were 6 million other voices like that that were snuffed out that we'll never hear, and we need to remember all of those. So thanks very much. I will stop my screen share, and then we can address any questions.
Thank you so much, Hana, for that very powerful story. And I want to also, I'm not sure if you know, but the author of the book you shared, William Melnick, is participating today. So we welcome him, and I encourage you all to check out that book as well about the story.
Oh, that's great news. Shout out. Hi, Will.
So there's a number of questions for you here. And I want to start with one that a couple people asked. This one's from Eugene. And he writes, were the perpetrators of Nazi policies and crimes in Czechoslovakia primarily Germans, or were there also as many Czech collaborators?
No, it's a great question, and it's not one that I know. I can't give you any numbers, Eugene. My understanding is it was primarily the Nazis. As you may recall, Czechoslovakia was the first place invaded. I'm sure there were some collaborators, but my understanding is that the Nazis came across the border and they established government run by the Nazis, run by the Germans.
Another question that we have is about the time when your dad was in the camp and separated from his parents. Did he see his mother regularly while she was there, and how did that work?
Good question. So he did. She was able to, the Jews had autonomy to move around within the part that was the prison. They were able to move around. There were parts that they weren't allowed to go to. My dad talked about there being fences. The kids would sneak through the fences when they could, but they had some autonomy. And so yes, my grandmother would visit him. He recalls she would bring him food, and that was an interesting dynamic for him because on the one hand, he was really hungry and the food was great, but it did not endear him to the other children that he had this special treat. So yes, she was able to visit him.
So 2 questions here from 2 different people, but on the same theme. One is, how did your parents feel about going to Munich when they had escaped Prague in 1968? And it continues, it's kind of ironic to get freedom through Germany. And the second question is, how did you end up coming to Seattle specifically?
Okay, so the first question kind of has a long answer, so I'm going to try and squish it down. So it was the second escape attempt that they'd made. The first time they tried to get out to Austria, and that failed. And I don't have time to go into the details, although it's kind of a crazy story. But so the second time, one of the easiest ways for them to get out was to take a flight to Munich. And not that that was easy. My dad had to stand in line for literally 2 days to get that plane ticket. But they knew that once they got on that plane, and he specifically bought tickets on Lufthansa and not on Czech Airlines, that they could get out. So Munich was the place to go. Also, my uncle that you saw in the baby carriage during my presentation had escaped Czechoslovakia as a pretty young man. He's 10 years younger than my dad, so he would have been around 20, and he was in Munich. And so they knew they'd have a place to stay when they got there. So that was that piece. And how did we end up in Seattle? The goal was always America. When we were in Munich, my mom discovered she was pregnant with my younger sister. The wait for America was about 6 months, and she wouldn't have been able to travel. So my parents are both engineers, and Australia wanted engineers. They were able to get on a flight to Australia. Australia actually would pay the airfare. They had a refugee camp, and then they would help them get a job. So we went to Australia, but the goal was always to come to America. And Seattle specifically, again, it was my uncle. My uncle had come here and had gotten a job, and he was able to assist my dad with getting that H-1B visa so that he could come to America.
That's so interesting. So I think we have time for one more question, and this one comes from Rebecca, and she writes, if your father were here on this call, what would he ask of us going forward? How can we honor his journey?
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. That is a beautiful question. So the first thing I will tell you is he would be crying right now. He could not give this presentation without tearing up. So he'd have tears in his eyes, and he would tell you, number one, don't forget And number two, be the change. Don't be a bystander. When you see something happening that you know isn't right, make a difference.
So important. And I remember him saying such words, so all the more heartfelt. And thank you so much, Hana, for carrying this on, bringing his words to us and sharing all these photos and these stories. It's incredibly powerful. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ilana. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work that the Holocaust Center does. It's invaluable.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's program, and to thank again our partners, the Women Business Owners and the Center for Czech Education and Culture. This program was recorded, and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow, along with other past Lunch and Learn presentations. It takes a very dedicated team to keep the Holocaust Center for Humanity running at full speed with virtual programs, including our Speakers Bureau, professional development programs for teachers, creating online resources, book discussion groups, our student leadership board, and so much more. I want to give a very special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who is running the technical side of this show behind the scenes. Also a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Dreidel, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, and our fantastic interns and volunteers who make this all possible. Thank you also to Michelle Quinones, who provided closed captioning for us today. Please be sure to join us next week as we commemorate the anniversary of Kristallnacht with a special presentation from Holocaust survivor Joe Lewinson, who will share his family's story of fleeing Nazi Germany and finding refuge in Shanghai. I want to thank you all again for attending today. We wish you all a peaceful day and look forward to seeing you next week. This concludes our program.